The Super Monkey Ball series features puzzle platformer games in which players control a monkey rolling around in a ball. The videos on this slide demonstrate some gameplay, just so you have an idea of what Super Monkey Ball is like. As you watch, I'll explain some more background information about the series. Most games in the series feature over 100 stages in which the solo player has to roll their ball into the goal within a time limit, usually 1 minute. The stages come in sets of difficulty levels and rely on different platforming mechanics or puzzle features for players to work through. There is one piece of music from the soundtrack that plays and loops for each set of levels. When playing, it feels like you are pushing the ball forward, but in actuality, you are tilting the stage at various angles to control gravity and the direction of the ball. The series' creators were likely inspired by the Atari arcade game Marble Madness from 1984 and non-digital skill games where you control a ball by tilting the stage. The series is published by Sega, and it has released over 30 games, but only 9 are considered its primary games for home consoles, as shown in this chart. The original two console titles, Super Monkey Ball and Super Monkey Ball 2, were popular on the GameCube, receiving the Player's Choice distinction from Nintendo. Subsequent games were not as popular or well received. However, there has been a resurgence in the popularity of the series in the 2020s, with 2024's Banana Rumble being highly praised, particularly by speedrunners. Another game from this decade that has been well received is Banana Mania, which is a remake of the original games released for various platforms in 2021. Unlike other remakes in the series, which mostly use the exact same music as previous games, the soundtrack of Banana Mania uses new arrangements of the original game's tracks. Therefore, it is an interesting case study on musical adaptations in game remakes. This presentation shows my comparative analysis of the soundtracks for the original two games and for Banana Mania. I argue that this comparison shows how global trends in electronic dance music, or EDM, changed over 2 decades. The music in the Super Monkey Ball series mostly, though not entirely, fits under the umbrella of EDM, which was a big inspiration for the original game's main composer Hidenori Shoji, as he mentioned in an interview with Estetica Cybernetica in 2024. EDM has changed significantly over the last few decades, however. It has become more globalized due to internet streaming and huge EDM festivals that artists and fans travel overseas for. But also, the musical style has changed. Most of the soundtrack for the original GameCube games could be described as techno, house, or hardcore, which were 3 of the 4 fundamental genres of dance music at the turn of the millennium, according to Nick Wilcher's 2016 article. The remake Banana Mania, however, uses more techniques from bass house, dubstep, and trap EDM, which are newer EDM genres. And this is exemplified by many build-ups and drops, as well as rapid hi-hats, heavy wobbling bass sounds, and a halftime drum feel. I will explain these techniques in detail later, but for now, here are 2 quick audio examples to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. So Mutator from the original game is a techno track that sounds like this. Whereas Mutator 2021 uses techniques from newer EDM genres like dubstep. It sounds like this. In this presentation, I argue that Banana Mania's new arrangements reflect how global trends of EDM style changed from 2001 to 2021. Furthermore, the new arrangements exemplify an aspect of what media historian Logan Brown calls temporalization, which is the adaptation of a work across time, such that it becomes culturally relevant and current. Brown compares temporalization in game remakes to localization, which is the adaptation of a work across geographical regions. My conclusions are based on my analysis of all 67 tracks on two soundtrack albums from 2021, one for the remake and one for the classic soundtrack of the original two games, which is DLC in Banana Mania. For example, I identified the percentage of tracks on each album that use specific techniques associated with newer EDM. Video game remakes have become increasingly popular in recent years, along with ports, remasters, and reboots. In his article about Final Fantasy VII Remake, Kyle Worrell explains the difference between these four categories of game adaptations. Ports are the bringing of an existing product to a new platform, often with quality of life updates. Reboots are the restarting of a franchise from a new title, usually with a new story. Remasters are the updating of the quality of an existing product by creating a new master version of a file through alteration or enhancement. And finally, remakes are when an original game is made new in a different form. Notably, Worrell states that compared to other types of adaptations, remakes do the most to bring themselves up to meet the expectations of modern audiences. In James Dennis McGlynn's article, also about Final Fantasy VII Remake, he defines game remakes similarly and compares them to film remakes, saying, "The aim of the game remake, as distinct from that of the film remake, is simply to take an existing product and recreate it in a way that is visually and technically appealing for a new generation, with different standards for technical achievement in terms of gameplay, graphics, music, narrative." By these definitions, Super Monkey Ball Banana Mania is truly a game remake, and my analysis of the game's soundtrack shows how its new arrangements of the original melodies recreate the music for a new generation. Game remakes and rearrangements of original soundtracks have not yet been studied much in ludomusicology, other than for Final Fantasy VII Remake. However, some similar phenomena related to musical adaptations have been studied more. Some game series use recurring musical themes, with newer games adapting them using current musical styles and technological capabilities. This has been discussed for the Zelda series by Sarah Pozderac-Chenevey and for Pokémon by James Ellis. Game music is also frequently adapted and rearranged for live concerts, which has been discussed by numerous scholars. Furthermore, adaptations of game music such as covers or remixes are often published by fans on streaming services. In Super Monkey Ball Banana Mania, however, the new composers at Sega made new arrangements of the pieces on the classic soundtrack specifically to fit with the style of the remake. These arrangements are notably not remixes because they don't use actual samples from the classic tracks as far as I can tell. Before presenting the details of my analysis, I want to explain some further context for these soundtracks. On the classic soundtrack album, which has tracks from 2001 and 2002, two composers are credited, Ryuji Yuchi and Hidenori Shoji. Both are Japanese composers that have been working in the video game industry since the 1990s, although Yuchi has done less composing for games and more for television. Shoji is still affiliated with Sega, and his tracks on the album are credited as being by Sega and him. He is credited with 26 tracks on the album, including all the music from the original Super Monkey Ball in 2001 and most music from Super Monkey Ball 2, while Yuchi is credited for 8 tracks, all from SMB2. On the Banana Mania album, with new arrangements of the classic tracks, there are 6 credited composers and arrangers, 4 of which are affiliated with Sega, including Shoji again, although he only made 2 tracks this time. Based on what I've found through preliminary research and listening, each of these people work in the game composing industry, and they have eclectic musical outputs in various styles. They do not seem to be EDM specialists, and much of their other output is not EDM. This is interesting because it implies that for this game remake, they purposely imitated the classic soundtrack by choosing EDM for the new arrangements, but they also paid attention to global trends in EDM style and used newer EDM techniques for the remake. For this study, I listened to both soundtrack albums closely and created a spreadsheet with details for every track, such as the game levels, music genres, tempo, key, and formal structure, for example, A prime before a new loop begins. I also listened for the presence of specific techniques from newer EDM, such as the wobble bass, distinctive in dubstep. Some of this data is subjective, but I think it is generally useful for showing how the new soundtrack modernizes the old one. The classic soundtrack album has 34 tracks, while the new soundtrack only has 33. This difference is because 3 tracks from the classic album are not rearranged for the new album, and 2 from the new soundtrack have no counterpart on the classic soundtrack. The tempo range on the classic soundtrack is 110 to 170 BPM, while the tempo range on the new soundtrack is significantly wider at 85 to 184 BPM. Keys and modes are more ambiguous on the new soundtrack, with frequent interplay between relative major and minor keys on the same track. No clear differences emerged in terms of formal structures other than the use of more build-ups and drops, which I will discuss more on the next slide. As already mentioned, the most common genres on the classic soundtrack are house, techno, and hardcore, while the new soundtrack often uses trap EDM, dubstep, and bass house, which were EDM genres popular in the 2010s. I also investigated the use of 4 specific techniques that are commonly used in newer EDM, assigning each a letter, B, H, R, and W. First, I listened for whether each track had a clear build-up drop sequence. It is well known that EDM features build-ups, often using ascending pitch risers, leading up to climactic drops when low frequencies return. But what is not as well known is that build-ups and drops have become much more frequent, clear, and intense over the last 20 years or so. A lot of classic house and techno does not feature a clear build-up drop sequence, whereas most newer EDM does. Here's an example from Roll and Roll on the Banana Mania soundtrack. Second, newer EDM genres often feature a half-time drum feel, at least in some parts of a track. This is when the drum beat is twice as slow as normal, so the usual backbeat on beats 2 and 4, often articulated with the snare drum, is shifted to beat 3. Halftime drums are often used in metal music, but also in trap EDM and dubstep. Here's an example from Fatboy 2021 on the new soundtrack. It starts with a normal beat and then it switches to halftime. Third, rapid improvisatory hi-hats are a characteristic of trap music specifically. Trap started as a hip-hop genre, which is still popular, but trap EDM started in the 2010s, merging elements of hip-hop and EDM together. The hi-hats in trap music are known for being rhythmically complex, unpredictable, and quite fast, faster than a real drummer could play. Producer Aidan Russell puts it this way: machine gun 808 hats in rapid succession. Here's an example from Dinner Stage 2021. Finally, the wobble bass is used often in bass-heavy EDM, but it is most associated with dubstep. It is typically created with LFO modulation for the filter cutoff, so there's a very fast sweeping effect up and down. Listen to it again in a short clip from Mutator 2021 that we heard earlier. This chart shows the percentage of tracks on each album that use the newer EDM techniques just described. 64% of tracks on the soundtrack for the remake have a clear build-up drop sequence, whereas only 12% of tracks on the classic soundtrack for the original games do. 39% of tracks on the new soundtrack use halftime drums, whereas only 6% on the classic soundtrack do. For the rapid hi-hats, it's 27% compared to 3%, which is only one track. Interestingly, for the wobble bass, it's closer, with only 12% of the tracks on the new soundtrack using it, and 6% on the classic soundtrack using it. The big difference, however, is in how many tracks use at least one letter, which is 82% compared to 21%. Given the importance of these techniques for the types of EDM that were globally popular in the 2010s and still today, this chart reveals how the composers for the 2021 remake modernized the music and used temporalization to adapt the music for a new generation, while keeping most of the classic melodies to boost nostalgia for players returning to the series like me. To further bolster this point, I will now discuss one classic track and its new arrangement in detail. The track called "Star on the Black" is heard during World 9 out of 10 in the story mode of Super Monkey Ball 2. This is late in the game during some of the most difficult levels, and the setting is the space colony of the villain, Dr. Bad Boon. This piece is a techno track by Hidenori Shoji. Its tempo is 122 BPM, it's primarily in the F Mixolydian mode with some chromaticism, and it has a simple binary form, with a quick intro followed by A and B sections. None of the four techniques from newer EDM, B, H, R, or W, are used in this track. Here's the beginning of the track. And here is the end of the B section. This melody that you'll hear will play a big role in the 2021 arrangement. For the new soundtrack in the remake, Julian Taniguchi rearranged the original into the trap EDM genre, highlighting the melody from the B section of Star on the Black. It is now 150 BPM with key ambiguity between E-flat major and C minor, and it uses clear EDM formal structures such as build-ups and drops. It also uses a halftime feel in the drums and rapid hi-hats, so it uses 3 of the 4 techniques from newer EDM that I discussed. Let's listen to the second build-up and drop starting at 051, following along with this form chart. This study has shown that the composers at Sega used music as an aspect of Super Monkey Ball's temporalization, the adaptation of a work across time, as Brown would put it. The 2021 arrangements reflect how global trends of EDM style changed over 2 decades, by prominently featuring techniques and genres that became globally popular and representative of EDM as a whole in the 2010s. This is just one series, though. Game remakes are becoming more and more popular in recent years, and ludomusicology should continue studying how music is adapted in various ways for them. The existing scholarship has mostly focused on games like Final Fantasy VII Remake with its more cinematic score. But other types of games with different types of soundtracks, such as platformers, puzzle games, and sports games, are also being remade with new music. How do composers and directors choose and make music that is current and relevant for a new generation? What gets left behind? What gets kept and further highlighted for possible inclusion in a video game music canon? These questions and the study of music in game remakes will only become increasingly important as time goes on. Thank you.